Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. Our panelists are already lined up, so let's convene today's summit. And as always, before we introduce the topic, allow me to introduce our distinguished panelists for this evening from Ankara in Turkey. Ömer Özkilciltik is joining us, foreign policy and security analyst from Washington, D.C. Jason Brodsky, policy director of United Against Nuclear Iran. And here in our Tel Aviv studios, international affairs analyst, Mr. Dan Perry. Hello, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Our main topic, symbolic or a step towards rearranging this geopolitical chessboard here in the Middle East and around the world for that matters. What's the significance of this summit we're seeing between Turkey, Iran, and Russia? Are they trying to form this anti-Western alliance? Let's take a closer look, and we pick up the debate right after.
On July the 19th, Russian President Vladimir Putin arrived in Iran on his second international trip since the invasion of Ukraine in February. In Tehran, he received full backing for the war. The visit was announced as US President Joe Biden headed to the Middle East, where he pledged to use force against Iran as a last resort to prevent it from obtaining nuclear weapons. Thus, Putin's visit to Iran is seen as a strong message about Moscow's plans to forge closer strategic ties. For the Islamic Republic, Putin's visit is also a timely development. Strengthening ties with Russia gives Iran a counterweight to an emerging US-backed Gulf Arab-Israeli bloc. Iran and Russia, as the most sanctioned countries by the West, believe that extensive cooperation can lead to relieving the sting of sanctions. In particular, they have agreed to increasingly use national currencies rather than the US dollar in their trade, and is seeking to unite its allies around a common hostility against the West. Is this a symbolic summit, or is it a step towards rearranging the geopolitical chessboard? Are Iran and Russia building an anti-West alliance?
So let's get to it, dear gentlemen. Are Iran and Russia building an anti-Western alliance? You know the rules. You get 30 seconds to lay out your initial stance, and we pick up the debate right after. So, Omar, please take the lead.
So I personally do not think that this is an anti-Iranian alliance, as it was more about a perspective in Syria, and Turkey has some security demands, and therefore it has to negotiate with Russia and Iran, and both are opposing Turkey. It was a 2 versus 1 dynamic, and we have to say that with the Ukraine war, Russia and Iran are working now closer together, and Turkey needed to discuss with them and negotiate with them to get a green light in Syria. Otherwise, it could not pursue its security interest.
Yeah, so maybe the world is not revolves around us. Jason, your take?
I don't think that this was an alliance either. I think we're seeing a deepening of partnerships between Iran and Russia, but let's not forget that there are tremendous bilateral irritants among the relations in those 3 countries. Iran and Russia are competitors in the energy market. Iran and Turkey have been having face-offs over Iran-backed militias targeting Turkish forces in Iraq. So there are tremendous irritants in the background beneath the surface of all of the symmetry.
What a diplomatic phrasing, irritants, Jason. Last but not least, Dan, your thoughts?
What we saw is a summit of the sanctioned, or a coalition of the widely condemned. But I would agree, it's not exactly an alliance. It's a matter of a confluence of interests, but there's also irritants in the background, as has been said. If it was truly an anti-Western alliance, I suppose they'd have to recruit China and North Korea. But Russia and Iran are anti-Western. Turkey hedges its bets, and therein lies the strength of Erdogan, because no one wants to upset him too badly.
So, gentlemen, please feel free, of course, to interact from this point onwards. Maybe we're being, by we I mean I, being a bit too dramatic. Maybe it's not destabilizing summit. Maybe it's the exact opposite, as in last week we saw U.S. President Joe Biden visiting the Middle East, Jeddah, Jerusalem, and now we're seeing Russia, Iran, and Turkey. So maybe this is the way for the pendulum to balance itself. Maybe it's a balancing mechanism, Jason.
I would not underestimate the ability of the players who were in the Tehran summit yesterday to wreak havoc in the broader region. Let's not forget that Iran is poised to send Russia drones for use in Ukraine. And that proliferation is very dangerous because that's in the backyard of Europe. And so that's a tremendous destabilizing factor here. And also, there's the Iran nuclear deal, which negotiations are stalled at the moment. And if that deal is revived, it risks resourcing the very proliferation of drones and missiles around the region that people are so concerned about. So there is a destabilizing element here, in my view.
Omer, would you agree, a destabilizing element here?
So I personally think that, yes, for sure, Iran and Russia do not have their hearts on the right side, and that they have an interest in cooperating further on drones especially. But it is Turkey who provides Ukraine with the drones and which gives Ukraine an edge over Russia since the beginning of the war and even before the war. And therefore, we cannot say that this was entirely about Ukraine and destabilizing the region. It was more of a damage control because Turkey, Russia, and Iran have learned over the recent years that their interests do not align with each other, but they have to speak with each other. Otherwise, the damage becomes just too big for each side. And this is actually more about damage control than balancing the Biden administration, even though we certainly can be sure that the Turkish president is not quite happy that he did not get a visit from the American president. But we see that Turkey is normalizing relations with Israel, the Arab states, and Turkey is at the moment not quite friendly with Iran, who strengthens and shields the PKK in Syria and in Iraq against Turkey, and there are quite tensions. So from the Turkish perspective, this was about damage control and about negotiations and about having a working line of communication.
And let's stay with that point exactly. Dana Perry, is Erdogan's participance in this summit undermines to an extent the attempted rapprochement vis-a-vis Israel? And let's not forget that hovering above perhaps are the Iranian attempts to carry out attacks against Israelis on Turkish soil in Istanbul, essentially Iran damaging Turkish tourism or Turkish economy, even a classic case of frenemies, so to speak, right?
It's almost an incredible infringement upon Turkey's sovereignty. I suppose they saw that Saudi Arabia more or less got away with it and figured they may as well do the same. I have to think that came up in the talks between Erdogan and Raisi or Khamenei. But look, Israel is not courting friction with a country of 80 million people that is potentially able to wreak havoc in Gaza and in general get in its way. So I think Erdogan would have to go pretty far to harm his rapprochement with Israel. The Israeli interest is too great. I suppose if there's some kind of a three-way deal that enables Erdogan to invade Syria unimpeded, and Iran agrees to that in exchange for somehow Israel's actions being limited by Russia over Syria, that could upset Israel. I doubt Russia would go along with that because the fact that Russia gives Israel carte blanche more or less over Syria constitutes much of the leverage that Putin has over Israel. So it's a very delicate balance right now that I see around Syria, and you would need these three players to get a lot out of any maneuver to destabilize it.
And speaking of which, here in Jerusalem, obviously we need to take it all in the context of the political sensitivities here in Israel ahead of elections, but we do hear voices warning the current Israeli policy vis-a-vis Russia in the face of the situation in Ukraine, saying we might be compromising our green light, the Russian green light to operate freely in Syria against Iranian targets. But let's stay with the summit before I continue to blab myself to death. You know, there's this analogy, how can we measure time? And the answer is it depends on which side of the bathroom door are you standing, the waiting side or the one that is being relieved. So those 50 seconds that we saw President Putin waiting on Erdogan, are we making a big deal out of it, or is it an indication of how things substantially changed ever since Ukraine in terms of Putin's gravitas to an extent, Omer?
So we have to clearly say that this is a revenge from the Turkish president against Putin. We still remember when 34 Turkish soldiers were killed in Syria, that the Russian TV presented a clip of Putin letting Erdogan to wait and put a clock onto it. And this is a revenge because the balance of power has changed in favor of Turkey. Turkey has closed the straits, Turkey is supporting Ukraine, and Turkey has closed its airspace to Russian flights to Syria. And this provides Turkey with a huge leverage. And if a new military operation is being conducted in Syria, it would mean that many Iranian Shia militias would become a legitimate target, as they have been deployed to the region to prevent a new military operation. And what Turkey sent the message was, go away out of my way, or I will kill the Iranian Shia militias in Syria, to Iran. The problem is with Russia, and Turkey does not want to kill Russian soldiers, in contrast to Iranian militias. And therefore, Turkey is trying to convince Russia to withdraw and is trying to use its leverage. And this show of waiting was a portrait of how the dynamics between Turkey and Russia have changed over the recent years, as Turkey has pushed Russia back in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Libya, in Syria, and now in Ukraine.
And obviously,
Look,
yes, please.
I mean, I really have to say, I'm sure all of that is 100% true, but really what we have here also is the media amplifying this moment because it was so absurdly entertaining. I mean, here's Putin, probably the most reviled leader in the world today, having, supplanted, Kim Jong-un practically in that capacity. And he's obviously annoyed and somewhat humiliated.
No one puts baby in the corner type of...
we see him making faces and, tapping his foot, and it's hilarious. And it's clickbait, and this is why it was so amplified. Doubtless, it's part of the game that was mentioned as well.
Yes, the never-ending diplomatic tango. In the little time we have left for this part of the debate, Jason, when we're talking about mutual interests, both Russia and Iran are obviously under severe Western sanctions, and they're trying at least to have this alternative economy, so to speak. Let it be less reliant on the U.S. dollar or this barter type of economy. How feasible is that in order to bypass sanctions?
Well, I don't think it's going to be feasible for the Iranians in the long run. Both are weakened players right now, and I think but ideologically, the concept fits into Iran's supreme leader's worldview, because he wants to build a resistance economy to neutralize sanctions while deepening partnerships with Russia and China. And so this kind of framework fits into that mindset.
And Dan Perry, before we conclude, maybe Putin is just, the best geopolitical map reader, because as we've mentioned, multiple interests and clashing interests, but still he manages to navigate.
Well, you have to judge, you have to judge actions that take place versus the goals. And I don't know what Putin's goals are, but I have to say, if he were a reasonable person, then his actions of the past year would have to make you question whether he's really such a brilliant chess master as some of his very cynical acolytes would have you believe. I mean, Russia's been diminished in a whole variety of ways, and I'm pretty sure that Putin would have remained fabulously wealthy and probably sitting pretty on his throne, even without this maneuver, putting aside the morality and ethics of what he's done and the damage and death that he's spread around the region.
Well, we will be diving further into the situation in Ukraine, as day in, day out, many developments on that front. So we're taking a short break now, but we will be back with all three of you right after the break. Omer Ozechiltik, I was practicing your surname, Jason Brodsky, and then Perry staying with us, out for a 4-minute break, and we're back in a bit, continuing our summit about the summit. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Omer Ozechiltik, Dan Perry, and Jason Brodsky. Thank you, gentlemen, for staying with us. We're staying on topic, but shifting focus perhaps to the pending developments over the situation in Ukraine. But before we dive back into the conversation, let's take a listen to some of the highlights from today's summit.
Конечный результат зависит
The final result depends not on the mediators here, but on the desire of contracting parties to implement reached agreements. We are seeing today that Kiev's authorities do not have such a desire.
The illegitimate presence of occupying U.S. forces destabilizes Syria and the region. Also in the summit, it was emphasized that the strikes by the Zionist regime against Syria should be condemned and stop at once.
The result that would emerge from our talks will have a positive impact on the whole world, especially regarding the Ukraine grain corridor.
So, gentlemen, let's kickstart this part of the conversation with another 30-second round each. So we've all alluded, you have all alluded to it in the previous part of our debate, but is it more the this gathering of the underdogs or the alliance of the strong? Jason?
Well, I think that it's really more of the underdogs at the moment because Iran and Russia are subject to multilateral sanctions regime, and they are trying to protect themselves as they are encountering an onslaught of Western economic pressure.
Dan, your thoughts?
The easy answer is that these are underdogs because, of course, they all face sanctions. But I think I would also say that much depends on how you view democracy in the world. There is a perspective that says that in despotism is strength because dictators don't have to bow to the whims and occasional idiocies of an electorate, and that's not necessarily so wrong. So I think the real question is what the democratic world can do to give what for to this perspective.
Omer, your thoughts?
So I think that it's neither of the two, as the domestic political situation in Iran, Russia, and Turkey are quite different from each other. In Iran, we have a trilogy. In Russia, we have an authoritarian leader. In Turkey, we have a democracy with its difficulties, and with the upcoming elections to be expected to be an important one. So I think this is a gathering of pragmatists, a gathering of realists who want to cooperate and coordinate rather than to fight each other to the toes.
Yeah, the Alliance of the Pragmatists is a very catchy title. And now let's please feel free to engage in a conversation from this point onwards. We can't ignore the latest news coming out of Moscow. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov admitting for the first time since the invasion of Ukraine began, the operation targets in Ukraine have changed, he's saying. They now include control of new territories, and it joins multiple other messages from the Kremlin recently. My question to you, gentlemen, how will it impact the dynamics of the fighting on the ground at this point in time, Jason?
Well, I think that it's a reflection of some advances Russia has been gaining in recent weeks, and so they're shifting the goalposts. And so I think that that's what Lavrov is trying to do, and Putin is trying to do more broadly.
And Dan, speaking of messages coming out of the Kremlin, time is obviously an important resource, and they're not pressed in time, as they're saying. But Russia is facing a resources dilemma of sorts. Can the potential Iranian delivery of drones, which is still being denied, by the way, help Russia determine this dilemma of where to invest its resources?
Look, Russia's economy is surprisingly weak. I mean, the classic resources curse is that one's economy becomes too dependent on natural resources that eventually run out. In the case of Russia, it accounts for about 20% of the world's production of natural gas and of oil. And, I mean, that sector is probably responsible for a third of their tax revenue. And without it, they would be toast because the Russian economy produces relatively little for an aspirant superpower. I mean, I have to think it is rather undignified for them, for the successor state of the former Soviet Union, to be going to Iran hat in hand looking for drones. So, look, the fact that they're now moving the goalposts, I think, is a big challenge for the world because it really undermines the point of view that had been telling Ukraine and was represented by the likes of Henry Kissinger that you're going to have to negotiate with Russia, and if you only give up Donbass, maybe that creates a face-saving way out for everyone. It looks like Russia sort of pocketed that point of view, which did seem reasonable, and is now looking for more. And if they do get the drones, and if they do continue being able to find markets for their oil, albeit at a discount in China and India and elsewhere, this could go on for a while.
And speaking of oil, as we reported earlier in the show, the European Commission is now warning European countries very clearly. Russia is blackmailing us. Start cutting the use of fuel, otherwise winter is coming and it's not going to be pretty. What's the next phase of the war of oil in this respect, Omer?
So we have to say that Russia is using everything it has. It's not only using gas and oil. In the coming weeks and months, we will also see that Russia is using wheat, grain, and fertilizers as well. And Russia has already begun to shape the market. And we have an actual threat of a food crisis globally as well, not only the energy crisis, which we can expect. So Russia is pushing on all buttons, and Russia wants to end the Ukraine war as soon as possible. As the previous speaker said, the Russian economy is not quite suitable of managing a long, prolonged war, which the Europeans and Western states want in Ukraine. And therefore, I think the best option would be to begin to think about face-saving options for everyone. And to achieve this, Ukraine needs to be supported more. There needs to be more support of the likes of United Kingdom, United States of America, and Turkey. Other European states like Germany and France need to step up as well. And there needs to be a channel of trust between any country in the Western Hemisphere and Russia to talk about possible face-saving options, because otherwise everyone will suffer, not only Russia. That's for sure.
Do you actually think Putin is looking for face-saving options? I used to wonder about that myself, but by moving the goalpost today, it sort of projects that he does not, and he's just looking for victory. No?
Yes, Putin always would like to have a victory. We know that. But we have also seen what Putin is capable of doing and changing his position if he faces a first resistance. Putin wanted a military solution in Syria. He did not get it. He agreed to a settlement. Putin wanted to take Trablus in Libya. He did not get it. He accepted a settlement. And the same can be achieved in Ukraine if there is genuine support for the Ukraine. And there is a great political movement towards a real option for Putin.
Well,
part of the equation, real quick, part of the equation is if Erdogan can compel Russia as part of some complex, multifaceted deal to end its blocking of wheat from Ukraine. I mean, that's one of the big issues on a table right now, and I haven't heard much about it from the summit, but it might have come up, and I have to hope that it did.
Yes, we have to hope for that. Turkey is the only country who is working really on that, because otherwise we will have a global food crisis. And so far, I do not think that it's much optimistic.
And Jason, in the little time we have left, almost 20-something minutes into the conversation, we have yet to mention the nuclear deal, or rather the stalled negotiations over it. The summit impacts or not the dynamic of the negotiations?
Well, I thought it was interesting. If you looked at the conversations between Ayatollah Khamenei and Turkish President Erdogan and Vladimir Putin, it was Erdogan who brought up the nuclear deal, saying that Iran's view was justified. Ayatollah Khamenei did not bring up the nuclear deal at all in either conversation with Putin or Erdogan. He just was focused on the resistance economy and partnering with Russia. So I think that that's very telling as to Iranian intentions.
Well, I'm not sure if Putin is familiar with Janis Joplin, but I will quote her: freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. And perhaps this is what calls the shots when it comes to Ukraine. Gentlemen, thank you so very much for this enlightening conversation. Omer Kilchik almost right this time around. I will work on that. Jason Brodsky, Dan Perry, thank you very, very much for your insight. As always, hopefully we'll see you again on the show.